that slither in the cave. Sanctity fade in the open grave. In the dark the body's there. Distracted whispers fill the air. Ghosts materialize betwixt. The witch's black on crucifix. The pillars of the layer shake as necromantic tongues awake. Seers while the voice goes bad. Elders place the box the dead. Rocker comes to build a shrine. Body water serves as wine. The lips that write the river Styx. To bless a black on crucifix.
heard Christos, Blackbone Crucifixion. No, just Crucifix. From the Nine Graves album. This is the Requiem Metal Podcast, German Metal, Part 2. I'm Mark.
And I'm Jason. And once again, we are joined by our esteemed colleague and friend, Mr. Chris Dick.
Extreme Burper.
Extreme Burper,
yeah.
Yeah, we just watched some extreme burping compilations on YouTube, I think. Yeah, to whet the appetite a little bit.
Yeah, get us
this background information really helps.
We're trying to imitate Antti Bowman from Demolich as much as possible.
Yeah.
But to no avail.
But we, in part one, kind of started to establish the aesthetic a little bit, or at least like what makes this sort of German metal scene in the last decade or so kind of dynamic. We kind of end it with one of the bands that sort of preceded it in a lot of ways, the Excoriate. You know, they're kind of like an outlier. Mm-hmm. But Necros Christos, in a way, which we just kicked off with, they almost connect a little bit to some of the at least the kind of the style of death metal that Excoriate was also kind of playing. This is probably more a little bit sludgy and blackened, like Autopsy or Incantation or something like that. Yeah. So what's going on with Necros Christos in this Nine Graves record?
Well, it's an EP1, or it's supposed to be an EP. 40 minutes, right?
This is a pretty decent EP.
But it's kind of one of those records where it's instrumental song, instrumental song, instrumental song, and then I think every song is supposed to be based off a previous non-written by Necros Christos. So I think you're going to comment about Black Sabbath.
Yeah, was this the song I told you that? Kind of sounded like Coven, Black Sabbath, yes. A little bit.
The bridge leading into Blackstone Crucifix is a Black Sabbath.
Black Bone Crucifix, you mean?
Is indeed Black Sabbath. By Coven, so not Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath.
Yeah,
Black Sabbath by Coven. Yeah,
which is kind of part of that. I don't know. They're not really a proto metal band as much as like some of the aesthetic. I mean, for people that are unfamiliar with Coven. How do you describe them? They were kind of a byproduct of like kind of the weird 60s fascination with the occult, right?
And I think they were also I wouldn't say there's so much tenets of heavy metal in there, but for sure I think it's one of those foundational records.
Yeah. From maybe a lyrical standpoint, or at least like like I said, how they would
dabble in the occult.
When they do things on stage that were kind of like fake, like ritualistic kind of activities that like almost like Alice Cooper and others would sort of mimic, years later.
Right.
Yeah. And so you could kind of hear a little bit of that kind of late 60s kind of hippie-ish kind of psychedelic kind of vibe in some of the riffs. And one of the things that's cool in that chorus is the more I listen to this Necros Christos song is you could almost like sing along with that chorus. The Black Bone it almost had like a kind of a sing-along kind of quality to it.
Live quality to it, yeah.
For sure. So what's up with these guys then? Where do they fit into this puzzle piece of the sort of strange German scene?
Like Runes of Beverast, they're kind of one of the originators, not originators, but it's sort of one of the two bands that I put down as like being able to be sort of not flagposts, but not even a benchmark, but just maybe ideas that have allowed to be sort of spread around Germany a little bit more, right? I guess what I mean by that is... So, Runes of Beverast is pretty straightforward black metal, right? But then they start adding more doom stuff, whereas Necros Christos is more death metal. So, I think they're kind of coming from two different angles, but and they've done important things since the start of 2000s, right? The early 2000s. But other people have now looked to them as kind of being, important to the German scene, right? So when you look at German black metal and death metal, the first two bands are out of 5 bands, you're probably going to get at least one of the two, right? Someone's going to mention, what do you know about German death and black metal? Someone's going to mention Necros Christos or Runes of Beverast, or both. Especially if he's talking about like underground metal, right?
Yeah.
Or underground death metal, not nailed to obscurity stuff, which is a bit more polished. Mm-hmm. So that's what I mean by this.
This kind of pretty organic too. It's not as produced as
that's kind of what I mean
stuff,
by this signposty kind of like line in the sand. They're gonna be mentioned as prominence, underground prominence. And they've done interesting things over time. I think Necros Christos has 3 albums plus like thousands of EPs, and they're all kind of structured interestingly. Like there's this instrumental concept plus song with lyrics, instrumental plus song plus lyrics. And if I think
is it sort of like what Blessed of the Sick kind of was sort of doing in a weird way,
I guess,
or no?
I think there's probably either a binary pattern to it or something like an iambic pentameter kind of thing happening within the there's a numerology thing going on.
Got it.
If you look at the pairings of songs, like it'll be 2 instrumentals, 1 song, 2 instrumentals, 1 song, 2 instrumentals, 1 song, and then it'll switch 2 songs, 1 instrumental, 2 songs, 1 instrumental. And there's a pattern. And so if you look at the course of their albums, just on that alone is interesting, right? It's like, what are they doing here? Was there a numerology thing at play?
Is there, in the EP's called 9 Graves, is there...
I don't know.
Does the 9 have something to do with that? The trio kind of aspect?
Don't know. Yeah, I mean, the main guy in the band the main guys in the band are pretty interesting, articulate. And the first thing you think is, they're just dunderheaded, death metalers, right? They're just writing about the typical things you see in death metal, like, graves and...
Blackbone Crucifix kind of sounds like a... It doesn't
like
sound...
a satiric something.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
It sounds kind of tongue-in-cheek or something like that.
But it's entirely not. These guys are, very well studied. They're going back to the original things like the Torah, and digging into that Torah, and they're trying to learn Hebrew in order to derive where certain things started.
Is that where the title of the band is coming from? This kind of reference point to Christ or Necros?
I don't remember following up on where the band name came from, but I was just reading some interviews recently where they were talking about instead of looking at the Old Testament, it was a derivation after the fact. Sure. Or the Quran, which is a derivation after the fact. The Torah was something that was done at the time. So they can there's a lot of historical context to it. So that they're really looking at that from a educational standpoint, an informative standpoint, and also a spiritual standpoint. So there's a connection to ancient Levantine religions, specifically starting with the Torah as a sort of the first thing with written language. Yeah. And people like Gnosticism, right? Yeah. Around Gnostics, that. Yeah.
Who are the more mystical aspects of kind of monotheistic religions.
Exactly.
So a lot of females too.
Yeah.
It was a lot of the Gnostic scriptures are, of course, for people who don't know, the scriptures of the Old and New Testament that were essentially edited out.
Right.
When Constantine held the Council of Nicaea, they decided what went in the Bible and what went out, and that's the really beginning of true Christianity today. That kind of decides the pathways.
He wasn't a Christian until he died.
No, he died on his deathbed and got scared and said, I better convert. His mother was a Christian, but so in the Gnostic scriptures, if you're a fan of History Channel, they do a lot of hidden secrets of the Bible. When they're not talking about ancient aliens and other bullshit and Hitler. Right.
Or there's bunkers and
Ice Road. Did you say Ice Road Truckers?
No, Hitler's bunkers.
Hitler's bunkers.
Hitler's bunkers. Yeah,
is it Ice Road Truckers History Channel too? I mean, it's.
I'm sure it is.
They do everything but sometimes.
Or that's the Travel Channel.
Is it? I don't know. Yeah, probably. I as a history teacher, it frustrates me because I would love to use something called the History Channel as a resource. And maybe 10 years ago it was, or 15 years ago, but now it's just...
Go on Netflix and type in Hitler and see how many different...
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Hitler different random...
It must test very well.
But the Gnostic stuff is really kind of interesting. I believe the Gnostics were the ones that don't portray a virgin birth. I think they talk about it more in kind of organic, realistic, non-mystical sort of terms and stuff. But there are some aspects of the Gnostics that are also...
Jesus had a wife because it was common to have, a partner back then. Yes. It wasn't the hit that he was this,
But if you're trying to portray Christ as this person of sacrifice, right? He sacrificed having
something other
family,
other
all this other stuff that sets him apart that you're supposed to,
worship,
or you're supposed to be, he's an aspirational.
Well, a lot of the Da Vinci Code stuff makes reference to Gnostic stuff. Yeah. In the Dan Brown books and stuff like that. They talk about Constantine and what was hidden at the Council of Nicaea, and there probably are a lot of really fucking fascinating stuff to that, like
Sure.
because again, you're essentially editing something that has had such a profound impact on the kind of psyche of the world, really, and the direction that like
They didn't know that
civilizations played. Yeah, exactly. They were like,
But yeah, no, I mean, the biggest problem with the Bible is that people took parts of it literally.
yeah, and that it's been edited and translated and all these other kind of different things.
Whoever's in power, that's the tilt on it. But
so that's interesting. I didn't know that much about the band to know like that's kind of where they're sort of coming from.
Yeah, I think it's some a pretty in-depth interview on Bardo methodology, which is a Swedish webzine. Usually does pretty good interviews with hard to interview subjects.
Okay.
The interview format's a bit strange. You got to get used to it because sometimes it looks like you're reading the quote. Sometimes it looks like you're reading a paragraph that the author has written. So it doesn't do the typical kind of like it's a Q&A format, but it looks like it's an article format. So it's a little bit weird to read, but once you get used to sort of delineating between a comment that the author's making versus a quote from the band, it's cool.
And what's this called again? Bardo
methodology.
Methodology? Huh. Is that just an online zine?
Yeah, BARDO methodology.
Okay.
Yeah.
So kind of like I just think Bardo Pond is the band that kind of jumps out. So when I'm spelling that. So.
Yeah, Bardo methodology.
Huh. Interesting.
So that's kind of, they have a really good interview. It's a print zine too, I believe. With Necros Christos on that website, and this is where they talk about their journey educationally to learn more about the Torah and what it would, what it means, what's happening, what are the, again, Genesis stories and origin stories and darkness and light and it's pretty cool. Nice.
Now, am I wrong in hearing things from a musical standpoint outside of the lyrics and stuff? That beyond like just kind of the sludgy, blackened kind of death metal of like Autopsy, Incantation, that I start to hear some kind of elements of kind of like grave, convulse, edge of sanity, like some of those kind of like, I don't want to say psychedelic, it's the wrong kind of term, but like those kind of groovy, almost like the Finnish things you hear from like Convulse or early Zizma or something like that. Like, am I kind of incorrect in hearing the presence of that, or do you think that's just that they were playing on that riff from Coven for this particular song, so they're bringing in some of that late 60s kind of grooviness to it? Because you're more familiar with the back catalog, so that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I think the catching of this Nine Graves EP is a little bit different, right?
Okay.
The full length, but the catchiness is probably unique to this a little bit. This song in particular. But usually it's pretty much like, the American style death metal, like the Incantations, right, of the world. And I think that's kind of, these guys are a spawn of that.
Okay.
But now they've morphed into something entirely unique. Right?
Have they done stuff since the Nine Graves? Because this is 2014, so have they put things out since then?
I believe,
there's a couple.
Is there a couple? Okay.
Yeah, there's a full length after.
Cool.
The live album.
It's a Domidon do Exmidon.
Latin?
Probably Greek.
Greek? Okay.
Yeah. But this looks like a 3 CD set on Sepulchral Voice. Again, there's a connection. There's a label connection. This Sepulchral Voice and Van Records, the other great German independent out there today. They were doing like Runes of Beverast, right? Chapel Disease.
Mm-hmm.
I always forget the name of that band that everyone loved. That female singer, Occult, Decibel Tour.
Blood Ceremony?
But no.
Yeah. I know exactly what you're talking about. One of the members died. Yeah. Right.
Cilium Lucci.
Yeah. The hell they were on that. They were on the tour with.
It's Blood something though. Blood Ceremony.
No, that's what I was. It wasn't. I know exactly who you're talking about.
Yeah.
Gosh.
With a female singer?
Yeah.
On the Watain tour?
Yeah.
That was Blood Ceremony.
Yeah, but there's another band that's kind of an occultish kind of
Dutch
group. Were they Dutch?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to come back to that.
Yeah.
That's gonna drive me crazy. I know exactly who you're kind of talking about. I'm looking back through my notes to sort of see.
I'll find it.
Damn it.
Anyway, Van Records is a great label. German, small, independent.
Kind of like Prophecy too. Like Prophecy's kind of part of this equation, right?
Prophecy's part of this equation. Van and Sepulchral Voice. Yeah.
Okay. And what's the sub label Prophecy we talked about in last episode?
Lupus Lounge.
Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
there's a couple of different ones actually.
Nice. Is it like Witches something?
No.
It's totally. It
when you hear it, you'll be like, oh.
Yeah, well, they just put out. It was almost like an EP. They didn't have like a big back catalog to it. If you type in, if Mark's got a computer in front of him, if you type in like old Decibel tours,
I was looking through.
Is that what you?
Set,
Yeah. Well, so while we're kind of like waiting to sort of figure out that,
figure this out.
Yeah, it's like one of those things. It's not necessary, but it's just kind of like gonna itch at your brain a little bit.
Yeah.
The next band we're going to kind of get into, I would say, I don't know from a lyrical standpoint at all really anything about these guys, but they seem to be also deeply entrenched in American death metal a little bit, and more maybe like Morbid Angel or Nile or even Nocturnus, who Mark and I recently did an episode on, and that's Venenum. So where do they kind of fit into the German scene equation?
Don't know. I mean, in terms of they just kind of came out of nowhere. Really.
Okay.
I mean,
This is 2017, Trance of Death. Is that their first thing?
Yeah, that's the first full length.
Okay.
Then they had an EP before that. So, yeah, as far as I could tell, they just kind of came out of nowhere. They were one of the bands that, I was like, oh, this is... It had
Devil's
that...
Blood.
Devil's Blood.
That's what it is.
There we go.
See, I said witch. I knew it was like something like some kind of Halloween
blood,
monster. Some Halloween
We
monster.
were almost there.
Yeah. So anyway, sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah. So they just kind of came out of nowhere, as far as I could tell. Like, they weren't in bands before that were, like, huge or notable. They put out an EP, and it was, like, really good. And then when they finally put out the Trance of Death, you could tell that they, too, were also starting to think about death metal a bit differently, right?
Yeah.
They were thinking about it in a way that seemed more like how Tiamat approached it back in the early 90s, where it wasn't just intensity all the time. There was a little bit of you could be interesting and you could be different without losing your death metalness, I guess.
Well, maybe it's interesting you mentioned Tiamat, because I sort of wrote that there's a lot of really, there's the song Cold Threat that we're going to play has a really kind of inventive intro that builds to like a kind of a cool dissonant sort of riff.
Yeah.
And I said there's lots of icy riffs that are colliding with melodic riffs. And I said, and maybe you can answer this, I said the main riff in the chorus sounds so familiar, but I cannot place it. And it sounds very much like mid-90s, maybe Century Media even. And so when you said Tiamat, it sparked a thought, like maybe that's the band I was thinking of, maybe something from like...
Probably not.
Clouds, I don't even know.
Probably not. I mean, the Clouds is very hard rock.
Yeah. I wrote cool cavernous solo reminds me of something you hear in a Morbid Angel, Nocturnus, or Nile album. Like just those like weird angular kind of things kind of happening.
Yep.
So I don't know if there's...
if
I'm on target with some of the things that you think of when you listen to these guys. I haven't listened to the whole record, but
like, the inventiveness of what was krautrock, in the 70s, where there wasn't it was a community of artists. It was a sort of a collection of sounds, but it wasn't always a linear timeline of those things happening, right? In concert. So I mean, like Tangerine Dream was always a bit different from Almandul 2.
For sure. And Can was doing their own thing.
Different from from Noi.
And Faust was like the furthest, like on the fringe of experimental.
We get into freeform stuff, right? Yep. But what's the same is that they're all in this different mode of thought. Mm-hmm. They've taken the construct of pop music at the time and kind of turned on its head, and took in other things like jazz and classical music, and kind of melded new things together that really had no business being together before. And
at the same time, they were reductive too.
Yeah.
They really like boiled some of the essence down. Like a band like Television, which came out of the American punk scene, kind of had like almost like krautrocky aspects on some of the early things where there was like a repetitive...
Yeah, kind of deconstructed everything
they
down.
They call it Moto
built
Rick.
It back in.
Yeah, the Moto Rick, which is very drum sound, where it sounds like there's a motor. And you can, if you think about that rhythm pattern or that sound of that rhythm pattern, you can immediately hear, oh, Amandur, oh, Cain, oh,
yeah.
Everyone, know. So Mortaric was kind of the term that they use, and I sense that here too with Venenum. I sense that sort of that with death metal, like applying the Mortaric concept to death metal, but also being less confined to the parameters of death metal, because I think they think darkness is not just one thing.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and I think that's I think krautrock, especially because this is a German metal kind of thing that we're looking at, is a really interesting foundational idea, because like you said, there isn't a lot that connects, say, the band will play after Venenum, Farsot, to Venenum, for instance. Right. But yet they kind of can all fit under like a sort of a bizarre umbrella of like collective weirdness, uniqueness, individuality,
right.
Sort of cross-melded ideas, like unfortunately, when you talk about like Swedish death metal, like Stockholm sound, it's homogenous in some certain ways, and I don't get like a lot of homogenous vibes from anything that any of the bands that we've been talking about are sort of doing, and that's kind of true to maybe krautrock. Krautrock is like, what is krautrock? Well, I don't know. There's like you said, Faust and Can, but they're like, they're almost nothing alike in certain ways.
Yeah. I mean, these are also terms that are
they're journalistic terms and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, if they weren't all from Germany, you wouldn't put them together at all.
It's true. Yeah.
So maybe we come up with a new term for all this here.
Yeah, come on. That way, this is a chance for you to coin a unique term that could define this.
The new wave of German death metal.
There you go.
Yeah. Your whole life has come to this point.
Yeah, well, you have until part 3 to think of one. So we got time.
Yeah, die Neue Deutsche or something. I don't know.
Kraut metal. How about kraut metal?
Well, what?
Kraut metal.
Nah,
come on.
That would go down bad.
I know it would, but it's catchy. It rolls off the tongue. Kraut metal. Yeah. But anyway, sorry. Back to Venenum.
So I mean, when I first heard the EP, liked it, and then when the album came out, I was floored by it because it was so much more advanced. Especially later on. I mean, the last 3 songs on Trance of Death just form this kind of picture that's really insane, and you listen to what the guitar players are doing, it doesn't sound like death metal, right? It's there, the death metal sound is there, but it doesn't sound like it.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of like doomy flourishes that start to come in, especially the end of the song Cold Threat, you know, so like what may start off as something, like I said, it kind of evolves into something else. So
so if they're listening, I sent them an interview a long time ago, and they never returned it.
Oh, those bastards!
They said they would, they just didn't. So I said I would sick Michael on them, but that was met with silence.
Oh, maybe they didn't understand your American style of humor.
I mean, it was over email, but I was pretty disappointed too, because I was so into this Trance of Death record. I was so excited to be able to interview them, put them up on the Decibel website,
and kind of get them like a pedestal to launch.
Give them a little bit of a push. And maybe they didn't want it.
Yeah, that's
they could have told me that. They said, you know what, this is too much. Let's sort of pull this back a little bit. Let you be the fanboy, but you don't need to write about it.
Sure.
And I would be like, oh, I get it. I understand.
No.
It made me not want to order a T-shirt. Like I was that kind of annoyed.
Yeah, that stinks.
So
now, a band you have written about, because I actually kind of went back through some of my old Decibels to see, as I was doing research for this, is Farsot.
Farsot, yeah.
Yeah, I think did you write the little thing for the top 40?
Yeah.
I think you had the little the
for
blurb on them.
Yeah.
Yep. But we're going a little bit back with a song here, which is Insects.
Yeah.
And so we'll talk a little bit more about Farsot after we come back. So the next song we're going to get into is Venenum, and it's Cold Threat, and it's from Trance of Death. And then after that, we have Farsot's, is it Empyrean? Is it
Empyrean? Yeah.
Empyrean from their 2011 album, Insects.
Insects Look
That was Farsot with Empyrean from Insects. And then we started off with Venenum and Cold Threat from the Trance of Death record. And so Farsot we talked about in part one a little bit when you were kind of contextualizing the whole scene a little. Mm-hmm. And I had made mention, obviously our patron fans know that I mentioned Farsot as one of the more recent albums that I was kind of into at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019 when Mark and I did the first patron episode. They're obviously a band that I feel like they've gotten a little bit more attention than some of the bands that we've talked about in these couple parts. I mean, where does Farsot sort of come into the equation, and where do they fit with some of this kind of stuff?
Well, I mean, I think that I believe, and I have to go back to this again, look at this again, they recorded with V Centaura.
Oh, okay.
So,
gotcha. Yeah.
I think they're Bavarian. So I think that they have, that connection there to V Centaura. But as far as like just black metal, they're another one of those bands that doesn't really want to be known for who they are. So they use like different permutations of their names, and they kind of
random numbers and
exactly.
more numerology stuff.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess you could figure out, who's who if you were to look at that and kind of figure it out, like, because it does spell their names, but it's all done cryptically. They're just an interesting band. I think that they started off as kind of a sort of one of those atonal black metal bands that
almost like the stuff that was coming out of like the second half of the 90s in Norway, almost like some of those kind of like
maybe even closer to sort of like Deathspell, but less the French wave without
Blue
Snord,
and some of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. A little more adventurous, avant-garde black metal and more atonal stuff. Instead of being melodic, they were atonal, which is a different thing, right?
A lot more. I wrote even like Deathspell Omega and like even like Gorguts kind of dissonance in some of the riffs.
Exactly. There's sort of an interest in dissonance as a communication tool. What does dissonance mean? What is it? Is it a sound that's natural, right?
Like I always got the feeling that Deathspell Omega probably listened to a lot of Voivod, and I would say the same thing. Like Farsot probably definitely absorbed some of the Voivod approach to like we can make traditional black metal, or we can add some like weirdness to it or something.
So Farsot is it. They started out that way, but then they kind of on Insects they really changed up. They slowed down a bit and got more interesting. Mm-hmm. And again, I like it. There's if you want to look at like interesting in terms of riff quality, Enslaved is one of those other bands.
I wrote my last note is it says it's hard not to think of Enslaved when the 3-minute mark kind of comes in at the song. Right. They have a looming presence over I think a lot of progressive black metal in general, if you want to call it that. If that is a genre, Enslaved are like the gatekeepers of some of that, because they've almost tried every weird idea that you could try. You know?
I think that's probably like sort of a large extent goes to Ivar's just ability to try out new things and change chords in weird ways that have never been thought before. And playing them at tempos that have never been played before. So out of that comes people like thinking, I don't have to approach the chord this way or play or have a progression to go from a logical progression. I can have dissonance between the steps. Or even replace the chord itself with dissonance. So I have something that sounds familiar, and then it's something that sounds completely alien, familiar, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how I hear Farsot. It's being sort of in that sort of between world of being alien and familiar.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I mean, the word is Swedish for disease, I think.
I think so. I mentioned that in the Patreon episode a little bit. Because the latest record was what? Failure?
Failure, yeah. Failure, yeah.
And then, so what do you see as the difference? This is a song from Insects, which is 2011, and then where are they evolving and kind of moving towards, you see, as a band?
I think, they take a long time to put out records, like 6, 7 years, 8 years between records. So it's kind of, for that trajectory to be very slow and elongated. It's
hard to know what they're going to do next time. Yeah.
But, they seem pretty interested in keeping with what they have today, which is an extreme edifice, but less, I'm sorry, I'm yawning here. It has nothing to do with subject matter, but as I think it's extreme edifice, but also being far more experimental. And I think that's kind of, again, like if we look at the Syd Barrett Pink Floyd stuff, I would kind of look at, like Ruins of Everest, which is a little bit more elongated. I think Farsot kind of has that aspect to it, right? Where they're looking at some of the weirder things that are happening in rock music from history and applying that to what they do today.
I think there's a softer side to
course.
Farsot, though, than, say, Runes of Everest.
Oh,
a
absolutely,
little bit.
yeah,
I think
sure.
they're a little bit more approachable, probably. Even if you do have the kind of weird Gorguts, dissonance things, or Deathspell Omega, or Enslaved, or whatever.
Right.
Just like there's a warmth inherent in Enslaved, too. Like, Enslaved, are definitely taking some of the warmer things out of Pink Floyd. You know what I mean? And applying that to some of the things that they do,
Right.
What about from a, lyrical standpoint? I mean, we talked a lot, especially the Necros, Christos, and some of the other bands. Is there anything kind of unique that they're doing or interested in, or is it just kind of an overall mystical, black metal-y kind of typical sort of stuff there?
I wouldn't say anything's typical, although I don't know.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, I didn't know what your
Yeah.
kind of interview experience was with these guys, or if they had revealed anything to you.
Yeah, they talk, but they're not very. There's not that much interesting things to say, like about the stuff we normally talk about, right? Which is like darkness, evil.
Yeah.
I mean, those things are there, but they're not the focal point, or they're not being communicated as something that we're familiar with. So they're kind of taking that away from us to some degree. They're taking away, it's just Satan. Well, what is Satan? Is actually Satan a good thing or a bad thing? Right? Is it, is he the light bringer, right? As a fallen angel? Is he knowledge?
Almost kind of like a Milton approach or something like that.
It could be a sort of Miltonian approach to it. So I think they're kind of touching on those types of topics without being too on the nose.
Got it. And they're another prophecy band, which we mentioned before.
They're actually signed to the sub-label Lupus Lounge.
Okay.
Yeah.
And cool videos too from some of the things I've sort of found. They have like a interesting kind of video aesthetic, much like the Shamash and some of the other bands we were kind of talking about. Shamash, yeah. Messed that up. And so then from Farsot, where we're going to kind of go next is to a place very near and dear, especially I think, to the original impetus for Mark and I starting this podcast, and kind of like where we all kind of meet is Nailed to Obscurity with a new 2019 record, Black Frost. And I mean, here are just some of the things, the names of bands I wrote down as I first approached this. Rapture, Dance of December, Souls, Catatonia era, Paradise Lost, November, Swallow the Sun, Dark Tranquility, and Old Anathema, like Silent Enigma kind of stuff.
Sure.
I mean, that's like a laundry list of things that like we've been talking about since episode 1 and obsessed over for years. The peaceful bands, the Swedish bands, things like that. Even we haven't done a show on Rapture yet, but we definitely could on Futile and some of that sort of stuff. So where do they show up in the scene? And I mean, it's a kind of a left turn from where we've been here.
It is, because we're kind of, so they're more towards the north, of the country.
Getting closer to Sweden and Finland.
I don't know if that's. I think they may be fans of it.
I know. I'm teasing from a geography standpoint.
Yeah.
Because we just named a lot of those type of bands.
Yeah. So they came out on a small label. Was it Armageddon? Hold on a second.
Yeah, I didn't write the label down.
Hold on a second.
For which record?
The Black Frost. Their debut, right? Ish? No?
No.
Black Frost is a Nuclear Blast.
Oh, that's Nuclear Blast. Yeah. Oh, you're talking about their original stuff.
Yeah, the original stuff. Abyss was self-released, right?
Oh, okay.
In 2007, which is when so the earliest track we're going to play on this is Kathaaria from 2007. So they have a couple different records, but Apostasy, that's right, it's Apostasy. So they had a couple records on an Apostasy after being independent, and then they just signed over Nuclear Blast for the new record, Black Frost.
Okay. I don't know Apostasy. Who else is on that record label? Anybody else?
There are a couple good bands. the new Blaze My Sorrows on.
No shit.
Yeah.
I didn't know there was a new Blaze My Sorrows.
The Swedes are Swedes again. Very much the same. The album's just called Black.
Black. Oh, okay.
Yep. Very exciting. Fragments of Unbecoming. They probably are not too familiar with you.
Mm-mm.
Nightingales.
Lost Soul. You remember Lost Soul? Polish death metal band?
Vaguely. I do kind of remember them. Yeah.
They're on this label.
Were they kind of like a decapitated type band?
They were, yeah.
That's what I kind of remember about Lost Souls. Yeah.
Nightingales. Remember, so they had a return to form on an album last year.
Is that the Swano thing?
It was called Last Sunsets. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. He's always got his hands.
Yeah, they have a couple things. I mean, there are a lot of different releases, but a lot of things that were familiar to us back in the 90s.
Got it.
The Duskfall, for example, which is, guess who? Michael Sandorf from Gates of Ishtar.
Oh, okay.
So
that
you
makes
can
sense.
see how this stuff is kind of, I guess, easy targets, easy to publish when you're in that part of the country, of Germany.
So where did Nails of Obscurity always kind of sound like this? Or have they evolved into this kind of sound that kind of captures peaceful and some of the kind of things we mentioned?
Oh, yeah. So I think they've always been part of this style. They've had this style since the beginning. I think they're just better at it now than they were before. Yeah.
Because this seems like a kind of a potential big release, being on Nuclear Blast. The bands I just mentioned, I mean, those check a lot of boxes off for a lot of people, like in our age group and our fan base and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, they kind of have the lilting melodic line. They have the heaviness, the catchiness, the production qualities there.
Yeah.
They look like good dudes. You can see their faces.
Sure. So they're not even though they're called Nailed to Obscurity, they seem to like not just want to live anonymously in terms of like what they're kind of going with there.
And then I think the band name is actually a Hate Eternal song title.
Oh, really?
Which is interesting considering this is far more melodic.
I was going to say I don't hear any of that kind of stuff in there. So that's why I didn't know if they started, as more of a traditional kind of death metal band and then kind of became more.
Well, they were definitely more traditional when they started, but not like Hate Eternal.
Yeah, got it. Cool. Yeah. So, well, let's get into it because from Nailed to Obscurity, this
solo's great on this song, by the way.
What's that? Oh,
out of all the solos that we have on this entire set list, I think this is probably the highlight.
Where would you say the solo's kind of coming out of?
Don't know the guitar. I mean, I'd have to talk to Jan or Raymond to ask them about when they wrote that solo, what were they thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of hear some of the Kavanaugh brothers a little in certain parts
tone,
of it.
Maybe the tone,
some of that tone a little bit. Even some Gregor probably stuff is built into there a little.
Yeah, and there's some Anders from Kathaaria.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah.
So if you're into all that, I think you're in for a nice treat. And if you kind of dig on, especially the Rapture, Catatonia sort of vibes, I think you'll dig the bands that sort of will come after as well, and we'll talk more about those when we come back. So we've got a trio of songs because these songs are not quite as long as some of the other songs we played in previous sets. We've got Nailed to Obscurity, Black Frost from the Black Frost record in 2019. Then I'll need some help with the pronunciation here, Chris. Is it Agrypnie? And what is this song / album title? Grenzgænger?
Grenz is like border.
Okay.
So, Ganger.
Is that how you pronounce it? Okay, that's what I meant.
I have to look at it again.
Grenzgænger.
Yeah.
All right, and that's from 2018. And then we will end with Lantlos from an album called Melting Sun. And this is Melting Sun Part 1, Azure Chimes. Azure? Really? It's not Azure?
No.
That's my Italian.
Well, I was going to say that's Italian.
Yeah, sorry.
Azure. Soccer team.
Azure. Okay.
Azure.
Interesting. So we'll talk about those two bands.
So that's the old Azure Oceans, the Celestial Season song.
Oh, Celestial Season T? Yeah. So, but we'll come back and we'll chat about those two bands when we come back. Enjoy. You just heard Lantlos, Melting Sun, Part 1, Azure Chimes.
Azure.
I did that before.
Azerbaijan.
And then Agrypnie, Grenzgænger, correct?
Ganger.
Yep. And then we had Nailed to Obscurity with Black Frost to sort of kick things off. And so from Nailed to Obscurity, which kind of had a lot of the Kathaaria and Rapture-y, sort of peaceful things kind of floating around it, we sort of gravitate into a much more gazy, I guess you would say. I hear a lot of Brave Murder Day and kind of Rapture-isms, especially in the Agrypnie.
Right.
So what did these? This is kind of a totally different movement than what we've heard in Part 1 and the first half of Part 2. Where are these bands connected in any sort of way in terms of being part of the same kind of post black metal sort of shoegaze scene, or are they just kind of outlying elements within this kind of German puzzle piece that we've been putting together?
So Agrypnie, if we're talking about Agrypnie,
yeah,
right?
We'll talk about them first. Sure.
Yeah. So Agrypnie is, tied to a German black metal band from the mid-90s called Nacht Abdullah, I think. Again, underground German black metal from the mid-90s. They're still active as far as I can tell, but this is sort of their offshoot band to do, I don't know, like more emotional style music, like Catatonia, like maybe Opeth, maybe
sure.
Slumber, but I guess they're kind of around before for Slumber, but something a little more melodic, I guess.
Yeah, I even hear
a little more adventurous too. You don't have with black metal. You might have to be a little more in a sort of a silo or less adventurous, but this allows them to be a little less predictable, I guess.
Sure, and really great use of sort of the repetitive meditative notes that the sort of post the black metal, black gaze kind of stuff is really known for, but also like you hear that on albums like Brave Murder Day or Rapture Futile, where it's like almost the sort of simplicity of some of the notes and things. Now, you mentioned that they came from like kind of a mid-90s German sort of black metal thing.
Yeah, I think I said Nacht Abdullah, but it's Nacht Abducta.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Abducta, O-B.
Oh, yeah, got it.
Sorry, yeah.
Now, were you guys aware back in the sort of Requiem days that there was this thing happening in the mid-90s? Because I was kind of new to all of that and very like, I didn't get too deep into that, but you guys paying a little bit more attention to some of the European stuff that was happening in the mid-90s. Were you guys aware that there was like weird things happening in Germany, or were you just mainly focused on like what was going on with Norwegian black metal and
I don't
Swedish
remember
black
anything
metal?
specific, but
Bethlehem.
Were they German?
Yeah.
Were they German? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I never really got into them very much.
Yeah, I just didn't know like if this was all just like way off radar screens in the mid '90s, or you guys kind of were.
There's precedent for all this stuff we're talking about within Germany, and it's no surprise. Obviously, they're not that far from Norway. Capable musicians, why not?
In Germany, as we said before, is like a hotbed of metal and always has had like a really good relationship with that stuff.
So I mean, like if you want to go back to the mid '90s and talk about sort of bands that were around at the time, I mean, Disaster, who were more like death thrash.
Yeah, I remember them vaguely.
They're around Absurd, who's the most famous NSBM black metal band from that era.
Got it.
Agathodamon, remember that band on Nuclear Blast?
I kind of do.
Yeah.
I sort of remember that cover more than anything.
Blue cover.
Yeah,
right.
Sort of came out around the time of like Covenant and some of that kind of stuff. Yeah, I remember the
Imperium,
symphonic.
Yeah, some of that.
So Impyrean was more like the folk end of it, folk black metal, which we'll talk about who he's now doing is Son of the Sleepless. Right.
Oh, cool. So, we'll talk about them in part 3. Yeah.
And Falkenbach, who are also long storied sort of pagan black metal, originally claimed to be from Iceland or there was some super crazy story back in the early 90s where he said he was from either Faroe Islands or Iceland or something like that, but then turns out he's just he's from Germany.
I guess maybe I was aware of some of these bands, I just never got into them. Maybe that was it. Kind of like
Mark
with Bethlehem.
It wasn't on my radar that much.
Yeah.
But.
And Nagafar was around at the time.
The one with the
Grave Worm, who I never really liked. They were far too like Demu clones.
Yeah, I sort of remember that name sort of floating around a little bit.
And then that band, Osmos, that we could never pronounce. That Sausuga, remember that weird band name that was on the band that was on Osmos, kind of like S&M black metal.
Sausuga, yeah.
Satthoggua, which I think is like a Lovecraftian.
Sadomaso hyperspeed metal.
Yeah, there you go.
Trans cunt whip.
So
I was more of a Pungent Stench.
Well,
guy
yeah,
for my
you-
Acid
I would say
Metal.
this is like the the natural extension of Pungent Stench to the nth degree, but
Which,
in a don't interesting way.
Pyogenesis, dabbled in that with some of their side projects.
Right.
They're sort of like porn grind
Yeah,
kind of
the
stuff
gut.
and things
Yeah,
like that.
right.
So there is that like weird strain that exists inside like sort of German. I don't know. You always hear like all those stereotypes about how like Germans are into like really weird porn and shit like that, and like S&M stuff.
Well,
South Park like made a whole episode about like Shiza porn and shit like
Yeah.
that. So, no pun intended.
yeah. So anyway, so there is precedent for this. Agrypnie is sort of just a natural extension of them wanting to do probably something like Catatonia, but still very underground and very individualized.
Yeah.
They didn't obviously go the route of Discouraged Ones, where they start singing like that all the way through, although there is a lot of interesting nuances to their catalog.
Yeah.
So the catalog is pretty wild. I think there's like 6 albums now.
Okay.
So
Everything I've heard is awesome.
Yeah.
So far.
it's just hard to find. It's even from an import standpoint, it's hard to find.
Yeah.
Luckily now you can order directly from the band through Bandcamp or whatever. So
Okay.
whatever they have, you can order direct through them. So,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And I would kind of fit them almost into some of that scene that kind of connects to the next band, which is Lantlos, which, a band that I've been really into over the years is Alcest. And they seem to have kind of taken that like black gaze kind of thing and gone in a lot of different directions with it. And I feel like Agrypnie kind of fits into that a little bit too.
Sure.
Whereas like the Lantlos stuff is just like I found that because it was a sort of side project, or at least not a side project, but the guy from Alcest, pronounce his name because I pronounce it wrong.
Well, you can
Nige?
pronounce this. Nige.
Nija? Is
Yeah.
that okay? It looks like Nige or something like
It
that.
could be Nige, it could be Nige. Yeah.
And he had, I think, done some stuff on some of the earlier Lantlos things. So when I was
Yeah.
on a big Alcest kick, I kind of went and found a lot of his side projects, which included Lantlos and Amensors.
Yeah.
And there was another band too, and it escapes me that had some associations with Alcest. That was
He was
also
in
very.
Peste Noire, Les Discrets,
Yeah, it wasn't Peste Noire because they're kind of like.
Sylvain, Old Silver Key. He was involved. Nigel was involved in all that
Okay,
stuff.
all right.
Yeah.
And the Peste Noire stuff is pretty like
Black metal, yeah.
Well, it's black metal, but I from what I've read, they have some kind of weird, like National Socialism sort of weird association.
Oh, cool.
So
I think it's
probably
probably-
what's that?
it's probably more play than
It
it's
probably
play.
is, yeah.
Not play, but imagery to
Upset
provoke.
people, yeah,
Yeah,
provoking.
being French and all.
Yeah, for sure.
Rebecca too.
Yeah. But this is the first one without him involved and
is.
stuff. And, I have a couple of Lantlos things, but I guess I didn't pay as much attention to kind of some of their evolution as maybe you did. The name means without homeland, which is kind of interesting. And I know you said one of the things that has struck you about a lot of this like German movement is like almost a return back to some of like the German kind of cultural things, like singing in languages and
Right.
like traditional languages and things like that. I didn't know if that had. If
I
that
would
was
say
just
this is the
a
opposite
coincidence.
response. This is the opposite response. This is continuing
This is an
to go.
anti-nationalism kind of.
I don't know if it's
internationalist
get
kind
into
of.
that thing. I would just being maybe necessarily German, like just being from Germany, not necessarily having anything with nationalism or pride or anything. I think it just has to be with not wanting to belong or feeling like he belongs to where he is from, or what he's about, or what his upbringing was. So I think that's kind of where this is coming from.
Cool.
So it's kind of the opposite direction, just
Yeah.
in a far more subdued, I guess, position.
Sure. And one of the bands you said that jumps out to you, and I kind of recognized it right away, was Hum.
Yeah,
You
right,
know.
absolutely. Yeah. So the guy Marcus Ziegenhorst was doing black metal. I mean, post black metal with the guy from Alsace, right? And then this record came out, and it's like totally different.
Yeah.
Right.
Which Alsace sort of did similar things too, right? They
Yeah.
kind of like abandoned a lot of the black metal parts and just went almost like full gaze, especially like Shelter.
Well,
and-
Shelters are different, yeah.
Yeah.
But the new album Kodama is back to the
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yep, you're right. It's flirting back with it. I also heard, I was telling Mark this too, because I know you're probably not as into him as Mark and I, but kind of like mid 2000s Deftones type stuff is kind of happening in there.
Oh, yeah.
There's like a Minerva riff that's sort of built into some of that.
Yeah.
Junius, I hear some of that type stuff in there, and even Failure. So if you're kind of into some of those fringe bands that some metalheads are, I know like Decibel is covered, like Failure in the Hall of Fame before, and there are a lot of people that accept Deftones into their heart, even though their early associations with new metal, they've kind of seen that Deftones, way grew past that years ago and kind of went into more of a Catatonia-esque direction or whatever. But really, you're right. They have left a lot of the black gaze behind, minus some of the drumming that you sort of hear throughout the record. But the rest of it's fairly ethereal, know.
Here's a quote from him, actually, when I interviewed him in 2014, I think. He said, when I was younger, I felt the world was shit. All of a sudden, my life brightened up. This album, we're talking about...
Melting Sun.
Yeah, Melting Sun is a summer album. It's about the trips I took to the mountains where I had barbecues with great people. In these songs, I sensed the energy of summer and sun.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
So it's like a Beach Boys shoegaze, black gaze record or something.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of neat. And they're great. I mean, have they done something since Melting Sun?
They have not. So
I was going to say this.
They're in the process either of... They're quiet. They're a bunch of quiet guys.
Yeah.
And it's basically just Marcus, as far as I can tell.
Okay.
But I think something's coming soon. It's been a while. He doesn't.
Yes.
He writes slow and long.
And is he involved in anything else?
No,
just Lantlos?
Just Lantlos, as far as I know.
I know a lot of these guys have their hands in so many cookie jars.
Yep.
It's hard to kind of keep track sometimes.
Yep.
So that's kind of almost a weird anomaly in the midst of a lot of the things that we're sort of doing. And as we sort of close out part 2 here, we're kind of returning. I guess there is an Alcest quality, at least to the beginning of this Kathaaria track, but it definitely goes in a more of a traditional black metal kind of route here. Right. This is about the oldest that we stretch back on any of these episodes. So tell us a little bit about the song that we're going to kind of close out with, Kathaaria. It's called Archives of Doubt. And one of my favorite album titles of all the albums we're covering, The Complex Void of Negativity, which sounds like some Nietzschean, something, So, is this a one and done band, or are they still around, or did they put out multiple records, or?
So according to Metal Archives, which is sort of our sort of research gospel,
about the only,
they're still active.
Okay.
And the only reason I know about this band is because I didn't know about this band back in
2008.
Yeah, 2008 or 2017. I found them in 2017 through Michael from Ascension, Secrets of the Moon.
Got it.
Because he was talking, we were talking about like this very concept actually, this sort of German thing, what's happening within Germany, and it's just a coincidence, and he sort of smiled and said it's our time,
Got it. It's it's like a cresting kind of thing.
Right, exactly. So he says, well, there's one band that nobody knows about, nobody really talks about, which is Kathaaria. And I was like, well, why do you mention them? He goes, well, he's the drummer in Runes of Beverast. That's the live drummer in Runes of Beverast.
Okay.
And I was like, oh, okay. So, because I was commenting to Michael about how great the drummer was. Because, we were watching Runes of Beverast at Maryland Death Fest. And I was like, I was telling my friend Chris Ayers, who is a friend of the podcast.
Yeah, Chris Ayers was on our 200th episode. He recorded a little something for us.
Metallurges.
Metallurges,
podcast. So check it out. I was talking to him. I was like, check out that drummer. And he was like, whoa, that guy's incredible. So we were watching the drummer pretty much almost from this half the set on.
Yeah.
And then when I met Michael later that night, I was like, we were just talking about Germany and the scene real quick. And he mentioned Kathaaria. So...
Well, and what you'll hear in this song, especially in terms of the drums, is when they really kick in around like the 3:30 mark or so. It really reminds me like some of Frost's performances on like some of the Satyricon stuff, or 1349, or even like some of the blazing kind of approach that like Dark Funeral took. I mean, I'm sure there's more to it than that because you've spent more time with them, but that was the first immediate thought is like Nemesis Divina, Satyricon, like just where it's like in your face, like awesome blasting,
Yeah, I think this record is, it's a hard record to find, but it's pretty worthwhile. I mean, something that, Michael had said, if you find it, grab it, because it's probably not going to be something you'll see again.
Yeah.
And it's just one of those records that, it was released, in 2008?
Yeah.
Came out, and that was it. I mean,
outside of who else sounded like this back in 2008? I mean, Alcest comes to mind a little because of again the gazy opening to this song.
Right.
But I'm trying to find or think of other bands back in 2008 that kind of had like a mixture that was like fierce and beautiful. I mean, and it's not keyboardy, you know, so it doesn't have that symphonic quality, but it definitely has a more ethereal quality to it at times, you know.
Yeah, well, I guess kind of one of the bands that get kind of lumped into is that whole Decibel Omega
that's
movement,
true.
where
That's
you know,
true.
sort of metaphysical, sort of complex, atonal black metal.
Okay.
So that's kind of the group they're getting dumped into. Whether or not it's entirely representative of the things that you're hearing is a different story. You know, where Satyricon is not really lumped into those things.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, because they're more economical. They're like, especially, I mean, over the last 20 years, they've been far more interested in being economy driven versus complexity and being overwrought.
Well, I know we've talked through the years with Jeff Wagner about the idea of maybe doing like a Decibel Omega show, you know, and he's interested, but he also saw it as like really daunting because there's not a lot of information about them and just kind of like what the right approach is.
There's only like several interviews that are out there. That's the only interviews they'll do.
Yeah, exactly.
So that have happened and they're done.
They're kind of done now.
Yeah.
I guess being that, you know, you were very much firmly in the sort of the metal journalist world when Decibel Omega kind of made their rise in the mid 2000s, like what kind of influence did that have throughout sort of the black metal community? Do you see, you know, do you see a lot of bands that have like run with that baton like a Kathaaria, or is it kind of like, well, Decibel Omega is almost like an anomaly because no one can really do a lot of the things that they're doing, or we're just kind of curious for your kind of context on a band like that.
Yeah, well, I don't know that Kathaaria was necessarily connected to that thought. I mean, Decibel Omega's, you know, has been going since what? First full length was 2000.
Yeah.
So, and then when they got really good, which is, I think, in 2004 on See Momentum Requires...
Yeah, that was the first one that really stood out to me.
That was when Nicholas Sundin from Dark Tranquility, I remember meeting him and he goes, have you heard this band called Decibel Omega? I was like, nope. He played it for me on the tour bus, and I was like, holy shit, that's great.
Yeah. First time you hear him, it's hard to wrap your head around it, too.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, when somebody plays you like Gorguts Obscura, you're like, I think this is good, but like, I don't even know, you know, what I should be listening for or whatever.
Right.
So I just didn't know if you had seen any influence like from them in, you know.
Oh, there's it's all over the place. I mean, you know, it's, you know, you have the French bands that are like that. I mean, even like the American band that I was talking about the other day, Imperial Triumphant. Right,
Okay.
from New York.
Yeah.
You know, there's a sort of a similar thought there, but those guys are on a totally different plane. I mean, they're jazz musicians.
Okay.
You know, trained jazz musicians playing complex black metal essentially.
Yeah.
But I mean, like if you look at Mistherming from Iceland are doing that. Inferno are very sort of on that same wavelength. A lot of the bands on WTC Productions in Germany sort of have a little bit of that thing going where it's very atonal.
The atonal dissonance kind of stuff.
It's focused on dissonance instead of being focused on melody.
Recent Gorguts albums.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
May always has a Decibel Omega shirt on anytime.
Yeah, I
he's
think
play,
he was probably pretty into their composition because he's a composition guy.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I think they definitely have their hooks in people. Whether or not people can produce it is a different story.
That's the reason I asked that question. Not so much for the idea that, like, I know a lot of people like Decibel Omega. It's just the idea, has anybody been able to like run with that baton? Because you can like Gorguts, but that doesn't mean you're going to be able to pull that shit off. Like it could be like a pale attempt or whatever.
I mean, there's the ice band for Sarti Dowdy. I think that's how you pronounce it. Which means Black Death. They're probably the closest, I would say, in terms of being able to do what Decibel Omega did
stuff off.
or does.
I'll have to check out that New York band. I haven't heard anything about
Imperial
them.
Triumphant?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like, on disc, it's good on disc, but it's not like, when you see it live, you can see them as jazz performers.
You could, yeah.
I mean, like, because they're able, what they did when we saw them, it was they were playing live, and they were playing so loud, and then they were able to lower the volume just by playing.
Mm-hmm.
They're not turning the volume off on their instruments. They were just bringing things down, like, and they bring it back up and they bring it down. And you remember my friend Tim, who's also a huge jazz fan. He was telling me, he was like, that is cool. Like,
yeah.
He's never seen, that was something we'd never seen before in a metal band.
Yeah.
Do like very controlled instrumental things in a way that changed the atmosphere entirely in the room, right? From being just blinding intense and brutal to being very introspective and almost like spacey.
Yeah, and Mark and I, with Mike Johnson, who was a manager for all three of us at the New Moon Records, throughout the...
He's been on several shows as well.
Yeah, he's been on shows. The last show he did was Peter Green, Fleetwood Mac, and the Allman Brothers stuff for our patrons to access. But yeah, when you see a lot of like Northwood's performances, they get to like, especially once they start adding a lot of the saxophones, there was like, this sort of chaotic kind of amalgamation that was going on. But then like, once Nick, the drummer, could like kind of back them out, and they could get really like melodic and quiet and like calm, and then build right back up again.
Yeah.
You're right. I think it's
a mixing, but it's all organic.
Yeah. The organic nature of sort of how jazz can do that in a live performance. That was really cool. So, all right. So yeah, we're gonna kind of close part 2 out here with Kathaaria. This hard to find. Probably a lot of you have never come across it before. The Complex Void of Negativity. What label was this on? Do you remember? Was it one of the ones we've talked about?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Let's see. Kathaaria label.
Yeah.
End All Life Productions. Which I believe, if it was on that one, let me hold on check. Yeah. Is a German label.
Okay.
Nope, they're French. Small French label. Associated with the NED label, which is the normal Evangelium Diaboli label. So Abigor, a lot of the French black metal, of course, Decibel Omega.
Yeah.
So they're associated to that label. So maybe you're on the right. You're pulling the right thread.
That maybe they're getting a little influence from it just because they're walking in those circles a little.
And the fact that they signed in a label that is a sub label of the main label that did Decibel Omega. So maybe there's some kind of
and so maybe even the Alcesty thing because they're French as well. There's little buzzes of some of that kind of floating around.
Yeah.
But we really don't know what we're talking about because we don't know much about these bands sometimes because they're pretty mysterious. So
yeah, I mean, if anyone, we could ask Victor tonight if we see him.
Yeah, we are going to see Triptychon tonight, which is pretty exciting. So, but yeah, so all right, let's close out part 2, and we'll be back for a third part with Chris as well. Again, shoot us an email. Let us know what you think about all this kind of weird stuff that's probably pretty new to a lot of you out there, as it was to Mark and I when Chris first threw the gauntlet down with some of this. Shoot us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com. Check us out on Facebook at Jason and Mark. Follow the History of Heavy Metal Countdown on Facebook as well. You can find us on Spotify or on iTunes. We do appreciate when you leave us reviews on either of those avenues, and also on Twitter would be a good place to sort of find us hanging out as well. And then the website, requiemmetal.com, where you can find old episodes up through the mid 110s. So I think we're at 117. Exodus, I believe, was the last one. Mm-hmm. We sort of reposted from back in the day, and then good merch there. And you can also sign up there to be a patron, or you can go on patreon.com, Requiem Podcast or Requiem Metal. I can't remember the / for that one, but either one will probably pop us up. We appreciate the support. I think we're doing some interesting things as of late, especially with, having heard the Ophalamia shows and Nocturnus and some of those, we're trying to delve into the obscure a little bit more and expose people to some stuff that maybe doesn't get the spotlight as much as other things. We sort of went mainstream with the countdown heading to 200. We were playing Ozzy Osbourne songs and Judas Priest and things, and so now we've kind of, we're scratching this itch a little bit, which is good to show you that we do move in multiple directions. We're not always just doing classic things or famous records, but I like stuff like this, Chris, because it pushes me to spend time with some bands that maybe on my own I wouldn't be sort of pushed into.
Yeah, I mean, it's just another rabbit hole.
Yeah, exactly. It's a cool little rabbit hole, and it hurts my pocketbooks a little bit, but c'est la vie. You can't die with it, I guess. So. Although I can't die with my CDs either, but at least,
Yeah, you can.
Yeah. Oh, actually, Mark and I have an inheritance thing, so if he goes first, I get his record collection. If I go first, he gets a CD collection to curate.
We'll all go to good.
Yeah, we'll make sure it gets donated to the... Probably by then there'll be a heavy metal museum, so maybe they can donate us to it.
That's awesome.
So. But all right, cool. So we have
Life Productions.
What's that? Yeah,
yeah.
We have Kathaaria's Archives of Doubt to close things out with the Complex Void of Negativity from 2008. So, German Metal Part 2. I'm Jason. I'm Mark.
It